All right, ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today it's all about something we experience all the time, constantly, really, but, something we rarely actually stop to think about.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
Our senses?
Ah, the gateways to the world.
Exactly. We're going to unlock the secrets of how we perceive, you know, everything around us.
Ambitious. What's our guide for this journey?
We're taking a peek into Dr. Rasha Eldeeb's physiology handout.
Ooh, getting into some serious science territory
A
here.
little bit like sneaking into a medical school class, maybe.
Yeah.
But don't worry, no exams. We'll keep it fun.
Sounds good to me. Always up for a bit of brain-bending exploration.
To kick things off, let's try a little thought experiment here. Imagine you're walking barefoot on a beach,
Okay, I can picture it. The sun's warm, there's a gentle breeze.
and you're feeling that warm sand,
Mm-hmm.
the cool water, and then maybe the rough texture of some shells. What's going on there?
Ah, that, my friend, is your sensory system in action. Every one of those sensations, all those little details you're picking up, it all starts with special little detectors called sensory receptors.
Sensory receptors, so like tiny little sensors.
Exactly. Think of them as like scattered throughout your body,
Right.
constantly on the lookout, gathering information from the world around you, from within you.
So they're like the spies of our bodies.
I like that analogy. Always on the lookout for something, anything interesting to report back.
Okay, so we've got these little spies, these receptors all over the place. How do they communicate with headquarters? With the brain?
Ah, they've got a secret code. They act as transducers.
Transducers, huh?
Big word. But it basically means they take the things they detect, could be light, sound, pressure, chemicals, anything really, and they translate it
Translate it into what?
into electrical signals. That's the language the brain understands.
So they're like translating the language of the world into like brain language.
Perfect way to put it.
Now, in Dr. Eldeeb's handout here, she mentions like a bunch of different types of these receptors. Are they all doing the same basic thing? Just responding to different things?
Yeah, it's like imagine a team of specialists, each with their own, area of expertise.
Okay, I like that. So, who are some of the key players on this sensory team?
Well, let's see. We've got the mechanoreceptors. Those are the masters of touch, pressure, movement. Back on that beach, feeling the sand shift under your feet.
Yeah.
Those are your mechanoreceptors hard at work, sending those signals right up to the brain.
What about temperature? Feeling the difference between that warm sand and the cool water.
Right. That's the thermoreceptors' job. They're all about those temperature differences,
Yeah.
hot, cold, all that.
Got it. Thermoreceptors for temperature.
Exactly.
And then there are the ones, I don't really want to think about, but the ones that tell us when something hurts.
Ah, yes. Those are the nociceptors, pain receptors. They're the ones that yell, ouch, when you step on a sharp shell.
Okay, maybe those are receptors I'd rather avoid triggering.
Understandable. But
Yeah.
they have an important job, those nociceptors. They're like our body's alarm system, protecting us.
Right, right. Makes sense. What about taste and smell?
Ah, that's where the chemoreceptors come in. Those guys detect chemicals. Could be in the food we eat, the air we breathe.
Right, some taste buds on our tongues, stuff like that.
Exactly. But chemoreceptors aren't just about the delicious food or the not-so-pleasant smells. They also help monitor our internal environment.
Internal environment, so like what's happening inside our bodies.
You got it. For example, they help sense blood oxygen levels.
Yeah.
Pretty important stuff.
Wow, so even our internal chemistry is being monitored by these tiny little receptors.
Yeah.
Incredible. Now, are all these receptors, are they all on the surface of our bodies?
That's a great question. And the answer is not at all. They're strategically positioned.
Right.
Some external, some internal. Depends on their job.
Okay, so like exteroceptors and interoceptors. That's what this handout mentions.
Right. Extroreceptors, those are on the surface, like in our skin. They sense stuff from the outside world, like touch, pain, temperature, and then, of course, sight, hearing, and smell, too.
So exteroceptors are like our frontline guards, constantly scanning the environment.
A great way to think about it. Now, what about the ones inside our bodies?
The interoceptors, those are the ones I'm really curious about. What are those up to?
Well, they're keeping tabs on our internal environment, making sure everything is running smoothly behind the scenes. Like, have you ever closed your eyes and you still know exactly where your arms and legs are?
Yeah, yeah. Like I can touch my nose with my eyes closed. It's like I have an internal GPS or something.
Exactly. And that's all thanks to proprioceptors.
Proprioceptors, another kind of receptor.
Yep, they're a type of interoceptor
Hmm.
found in our muscles, tendons, joints, all that good stuff. And they give us that sense of where our body is in space, even without seeing anything.
So proprioceptors, internal GPS.
I like it. But proprioceptors, they're just one member of the interoceptor team.
Hold on, are you telling me there's a whole other category of receptors inside my body that I've never even heard of? My mind is blown.
There are actually quite a few types of interoceptors, each one with its own specific job. For example, visceroceptors.
Viscereceptors. Okay, those
Yeah,
are.
because they're found in our organs, keeping track of things like blood pressure, oxygen levels,
Uh-huh.
even, how full our bladder is.
Wow.
They're constantly sending information to the brain,
Yeah.
even if we're not, consciously aware of it all the time.
So it's like our bodies have this whole internal monitoring system working 24/7, and we don't even have to think about it.
Pretty
Amazing.
incredible, right?
Yeah.
But this is all just the beginning.
Yeah.
Remember, all these receptors, they're just the first step in the sensory process.
Okay, so we have all these receptors doing their thing, sending these signals. What's the next step? What happens next?
The real magic happens when those signals actually reach the brain. And that's where the journey gets even more interesting.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued.
It all starts with something called the generator
Mhm.
potential.
Generator potential. Sounds kind of powerful.
It is, well, in a way. It's basically the very first step in how those receptors actually communicate with the brain.
Okay, so walk me through it. What exactly is generator potential?
Think of it this way. It's like a little change in electrical charge right across the receptor's membrane.
So like if the receptor is a little power station, the generator potential is like the first spark of electricity.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And the cool thing is, it's not like an on-off switch,
What do you mean?
It's more like a dimmer switch.
A dimmer switch?
Yeah, like the stronger the stimulus, the brighter the light. Or in this case, the higher the generator potential.
So it's not just, oh, brain, I'm feeling something. It's like, hey, brain, I'm feeling something this much.
Exactly. And that's how we can experience sensations, with different levels of intensity.
Hmm.
Like, think about it. Stepping from warm sand onto a cold, wet rock.
Yeah, that temperature difference is much more intense than, say, just walking along the beach where the temperature changes gradually.
Right. And that's where the concept of summation comes in.
Summation.
Basically, it means sometimes, you need a bunch of those dimmer switches to really get things going.
Okay, break that down for me. What do you mean?
It's like this. Sometimes you might have, multiple weak stimuli, tiny little signals hitting those receptors. But when they combine forces, when they add up,
Yeah.
they can reach a critical threshold,
The threshold for what?
a threshold to trigger a full-blown nerve impulse.
Wow, nerve impulse, like a real signal, not just a little flicker.
Exactly. And that nerve impulse, it's called an action potential.
Okay, action potential, got it. So if enough of those dimmer switches get turned up high enough,
They can collectively, flip on the main power switch. And that action potential, it's like an express train,
an express train, where's it going?
straight to the brain, carrying that message all the way.
Wow, it's amazing how all this is happening inside us all the time. But, okay, the brain's getting all these signals, right? From all these different receptors all over the body. Does it just receive, like, a random jumble of information? How does it make sense of it all?
That's where sensory coding comes in.
Sensory coding. Okay, so it's like the brain has a way of decoding all these messages.
Yeah. Think of it as like a decoder ring.
I like that. A decoder ring for our senses.
Exactly. It's how the brain takes all those signals and actually creates, coherent picture of what's going on in the world, inside the body, all of it.
So sensory coding is how the brain figures out, okay, what does this signal mean? Is it a touch, a smell, a sound, and all that?
Right. And it's not just, what kind of sensation it is. The brain also has to figure out, where it's coming from, how strong it is, how long it lasts.
So location, intensity, duration.
Yep. Those are all part of the sensory code.
All right, let's break those down one by one because honestly, this is fascinating.
Sounds good to me.
First up, modality.
Modality. That's basically like how the brain knows if it's dealing with, a touch, a sound, a smell.
So how does it know? How does it differentiate between all these different types of sensations?
Well, remember how we talked about how each type of receptor is specialized?
Yeah, like mechanoreceptors for touch, thermoreceptors for temperature, all that.
Exactly. And that specialization, that's key. It's like each receptor has a a dedicated line to the brain.
So like a direct phone line.
Yeah, something like that.
Mhm.
And the brain, it knows exactly which line corresponds to which sense. So if a signal comes in on the touch line,
The brain knows it's got to be a touch sensation.
exactly. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter what caused the touch,
Mm.
the brain just knows, okay, this is touch information coming in. And it's incredibly efficient.
Yeah. Keeps things organized. What about location? How does the brain know where a sensation is coming from?
Okay, for this one, imagine your skin is like a grid.
A grid.
Yeah. A grid made up of tiny little receptive fields. And each one of those fields, it's connected to a specific sensory neuron.
So when you touch a certain spot, only the receptors in that specific field get activated.
Exactly. And that information, that specific field that's activated, it gets relayed to the brain. So the brain can pinpoint, okay, the touch happened here.
So it's like a sensory map of our body projected onto the brain. Amazing. But what happens if that map gets messed up somehow?
Well, that actually happens sometimes in a phenomenon called phantom limb syndrome.
Phantom limb? I've heard of that. That's where people who've lost a limb, they still feel sensations in that missing limb, right?
Exactly. It's because even though the limb is gone, those nerves that used to connect to it, they might still be sending signals.
And the brain is trying to make sense of those signals, so it interprets them as coming from the missing limb.
Right. And it just goes to show the brain is constantly trying to, make sense of the world. Even in the information it's getting, is it, well, a little unusual.
Our brains are so complex. Okay, so we've got modality and location figured out. What about intensity? How do we know if something is a light touch or a strong grip?
That comes down to, well, a couple of things. First, how many receptors are activated? And then how often they fire those action potentials. Remember those?
Yeah, like the express trains to the brain.
Exactly. So a strong stimulus, it'll activate more receptors, and it'll make them fire more rapidly.
So it's like a volume knob. More receptors firing faster equals a louder signal in the brain.
A perfect way to put it.
Right.
But there's another layer to this, too. The Weber-Fechner law.
Weber-Fechner. Now that's a name I haven't heard in a while.
It basically says that our perception of intensity, it's not linear, it's logarithmic.
Logarithmic. Can you translate that for me?
It means basically that our senses are more sensitive to changes at lower intensities. Like, think about turning up the volume on your headphones.
Okay, yeah.
The first few notches, you really notice the difference. But then, as you keep going, you have to turn it up more and more to get that same increase in loudness.
Right, right. It's like our senses are designed to, prevent us from being overwhelmed by all the stimulation, to let us experience a wide range of intensities without it feeling like too much.
Exactly. It's like a buffer. And this logarithmic scaling, it applies to, all our senses, not just hearing. Like, think about smell. You can easily detect a faint smell.
Yeah. But even a strong odor might not seem that much more intense.
Right. It's fascinating how our senses are both super sensitive and also, really adaptable.
Okay, so we've covered modality, location, and intensity. That leaves us with duration.
Duration. So why don't we constantly feel our clothes on our skin?
Yeah, it's true. You put on a shirt, and after a while, you don't even notice it anymore. But the touch receptors are still being stimulated, right?
And that's because of sensory adaptation. Our receptors, they actually become less responsive over time to a constant stimulus.
So, they get used to it and stop sending such a strong signal to the brain.
Exactly. It's like our senses have a snooze button for stimuli that aren't changing or, aren't posing a threat.
And this happens at different rates for different senses, right?
Right. Like touch receptors, they adapt relatively quickly, which is why we don't constantly feel our clothes. But pain receptors, they adapt a lot slower, which is a good thing, right? Keeps us aware of potential harm.
Yeah, imagine if we couldn't adapt to pain. Ouch. But okay, this adaptation thing, it's more than just about, not being bothered by our clothes all day.
What do you mean?
It's like it helps us filter out the background noise of the world and focus on the changes that are actually important.
You're absolutely right. It's all about prioritizing the most relevant information.
Our senses are so dynamic, always adjusting, adapting. This is making me realize just how much is going on beneath the surface,
It's pretty incredible, isn't it? And there's another layer of complexity we haven't even touched on yet.
Oh, there's more.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We've got to talk about the subjective nature of perception.
Subjective, meaning how our individual experiences can be different.
Exactly. Because even when our senses are, working perfectly, our brains can still interpret things differently.
Okay, now I'm really curious. Tell me more about that. So it's like our brains are doing more than just passively receiving information from our senses.
Way more. It's an active process, this whole perception thing. Our brains are actually constructing our reality.
Constructing our reality. Wow, so it's not just a one-way street, like senses gather info, send it to the brain, the end.
Nope. It's more like a feedback loop. The brain is filtering information, interpreting it, and get this, even predicting what's coming next based on what we've experienced before.
So our brains are like mini fortune tellers for our senses. That makes me think of, those optical illusions.
Perfect example. Optical illusions, they play with those shortcuts that our brains take, to make sense of things quickly.
Right, right. And they highlight how what we perceive isn't always exactly what's actually there.
Exactly. It's shaped by our expectations, by our past experiences. It's not just about the raw data coming in.
Which means we all experience the world a little differently.
Exactly. Even back on that beach, what you perceive as hot sand might feel different to me.
Huh. That's interesting. Makes you wonder, if our perceptions are so influenced by our brains, by our individual experiences,
Huh.
how much of what we experience is actually an accurate representation of, the real world out there.
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a
Sure.
classic philosophical debate, and probably one without a single, definitive answer.
Whoa, that's getting pretty deep. But I guess it makes sense. Our senses, our brains, they're so complex.
Definitely.
So I guess what we've learned is that our senses are way more than just, biological processes. They're like the foundation of how we experience, well, everything.
Beautifully put.
And now that we know a little bit more about how it all works, all those tiny receptors, the brain decoding all those signals, what do we do with this knowledge?
Well, we can use it. Pay attention. Be more present. Notice the little things, the way your coffee feels warm in your hands, or, I don't know, the texture of a leaf.
It's like we have this amazing gift, but we kind of walk around oblivious to it most of the time.
It's true, but we can change that. We can choose to tune in, to really experience the world around us.
And the cool thing is, our perception, to a large extent, really does become our reality. So why not focus on the positive?
That's a great point. We can choose to focus on the beautiful, the inspiring. Our senses can be a source of so much joy if we let them.
That's a great reminder. To slow down, pay attention to those little sensory details, appreciate all the richness the world has to offer. Well, thanks to all our listeners for joining us on this deep dive into the senses.
Always a pleasure. Until next time, keep exploring.